Warning: this video contains major story and lore spoilers for the Genshin Impact Archon quest, Truth Amongst the Pages of Purana, version Luna 7. If you haven't completed this quest yet and want to avoid spoilers, please click away now. Proceed at your own risk. Disclaimer: this is a fan-made theory and discussion video created purely for entertainment purposes. All speculations, conjectures, and theories presented are entirely my own and are not affiliated with or endorsed by Hoyoverse. Genshin Impact and all related characters, artwork, music, and trademarks belong to Hoyoverse and their respective owners. If you play the quest, welcome. Share your own theories and thoughts in the comments section below. So, a lot of us had assumptions going into the recent version Luna 7 quest. Most of those assumptions revolved around the lore of the past and where the story was heading next, especially regarding the endgame and the overall direction of the story. So, a couple of content creators had already spoken about this. Many people believe that Truth Amongst the Pages of Purana had been retconned. And the common argument was that it was simply the result of, a mistranslation and that the events described there were never actually going to happen. And so because of that, people started saying things like, oh yeah, Genshin changes all the time. Or they're not really loyal to their roadmap. Other content creators also argued that the game wasn't going to stay particularly faithful to Travail. That became a pretty common belief, not just among creators, but among players in general. So then this version released, and a lot of people were like, yo, this is crazy! And suddenly, Truth Amongst the Pages of Purana was back in the conversation. It turned out it was never retconned at all. It has simply been repurposed. Although, honestly, repurpose might be the right word. It's possible that during the development, they realized, wait a minute, this actually ties together a loose thread if we use it in this section of the story. Like, instead of being used in this position, they changed it to way more later in the story. So, they adjusted in how they implemented it. And honestly, it was a bit of a debate. So, there was that. Hey guys, if you don't remember me, I'm Star Mercenary, or Star Merc for short. It's been a long time since I last recorded a video, probably over 3 weeks. Most likely 4 as of recording this video, and which makes sense. Life happened, things came up, and that's just how it goes sometimes. So that doesn't mean I stop recording though. I still make videos, it'll just continue to be sporadic as I said before. So this particular video has been in the works for quite a while. As I continued working on it, I realized it needed a lot more refinement, to make the ideas clearer, easy to follow, and more coherent overall. That's why the scripting process took so long. Normally it doesn't take much, but in this case, I had to divulge in it a bit, so it took some time. Ironically, the recording itself is always the easiest part. You can always just, grab a camera, point it at you, hit record, and done. And that's it. So if you've been waiting on this video, well, probably not, I appreciate your patience either way, and I hope you forgive me for taking a little longer than usual to get it out. So today I'm going to be talking about a couple of things. Mostly we're going to discuss the recent Genshin Impact quest, some common assumptions and misconceptions that many of us had, and a few theories people were discussing before release, and even some possibilities for Snezhnaya moving forward. And at the very end of the video, I'm gonna show a little something that I made. It's not anything huge, but it's just something I made on the whim, and by the end of the video, you'll see what I mean. But for now, we'll keep it under wraps just for a bit. So if you're interested in that part, you can skip ahead in this timestamp right here. I'll put it right here on the screen. So feel free to check it out. Alright, so at this point in the game, the quest genuinely shocked a lot of people. I was shocked too. When I finished it, my reaction was basically, whoa, what just happened? And at the same time, it still made sense to me because I was paying close enough attention to follow what's happening. Although I admit I was definitely swept up by the hype. I mean, who wouldn't? And the quest moved at an incredible pace. Like every few minutes we were going from one major revelation, I'm still dyslexic, to another. Lore drop after lore bomb, and on top of that we got tons of reunions, We met Jet again, we met the Aranara, we met Pari, we met Lilupar. We got to reconnect with so many characters and groups we've encountered throughout Samara's story and in the world quest too, which was honestly amazing. And that feeling was amazing too. And so I really like the new feature that Hoyoverse introduced in this patch, or in this version. The guiding notes that briefly explain, who the characters are, their history, and their recent adventures that they had with us. And it reminded players why they're important. and it was a smart addition in my opinion. So a lot of people were so caught up in the reunions and lore reveals, they didn't really know what to expect from the quest itself. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Outside of the trailer, none of us really knew what the premise was going to be entirely. We could only speculate, and because of that, many of us started making assumptions, at least for that quest specifically. And even assumptions that we had before were starting to creep back in again. So let's talk about them. One of the first assumptions that many of us had was that the Heavenly Principles created Irminsul. The common belief was that Irminsul was something the Heavenly Principles brought into Teyvat and established after their arrival. And so because of that, many people assumed that Irminsul didn't exist during the era of dragons. And there was no fate system at all during that time. And the answer, surprisingly, is both yes and no. So yes, it appears that there wasn't a system of fate as we currently understand it during the Age of Dragons, during the Dragon Era. But no, Irminsul itself did not originate with the Heavenly Principles. The quest basically confirmed that Irminsul existed long before they arrived, which is honestly a huge revelation for a lot of people who were pretty much curious about Irminsul for some time now. What was different wasn't its existence, it was its purpose. Originally, Irminsul most likely functioned as something close to like a fountain of life, a primordial structure that maintained vitality and balance with the world. It wasn't originally designed as an anchor of fate. That was never its original purpose. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of concepts like the imaginary tree and the Sea Quanta from, Honkai Impact 3rd, or the imaginary tree theory in Honkai Star Rail. Those are some pretty good references too. And so it was less of a fate management system and more of a foundational force that sustained existence itself. And that might explain why Apep described it as it radiating primordial power before the Heavenly Principles took over it and, reshaped its purpose. So that's one assumption that we got wrong. And a lot of us got it wrong. Honestly, you can't really blame people for making that assumption. Even I got that assumption wrong too. I made that assumption myself. So for years, players around the world believed that the Heavenly Principles created Irminsul. And now we know they didn't. The more I think about it, the more sense it actually makes, really. In Nicole's trailer, one of the angels says, "Our master is neither all-powerful nor all-knowing." In other words, they're not the strongest being in existence, nor are they completely omniscient. The trailer also mentions that their plans are not without flaws. Basically, they're not perfect. And what's interesting is that this idea lines up with what we learned during the quest. Apep specifically mentions the very thing the Heavenly Principles created, yet humanity failed to protect it. And to me, that's a direct example of one of those flaws. And the Heavenly Principles may have expected opposition from the dragons, and they may have expected opposition from the Abyss. But what they didn't, apparently, anticipate was humanity itself becoming the cause of Irminsul's destruction. They didn't expect its own creation to be the cause of the destruction of the system of fate that they put forth. Now, that's still an assumption on my part. We don't know exactly how far ahead they were thinking. Maybe they anticipated some level of human involvement, maybe they didn't. Personally, I think they were more focused on external threats, something along the lines of the dragons might attack, the Abyss might attack, humanity probably won't. After all, in the quest trailer, Nahida literally said the survival of Teyvat is far more important than the survival of a single nation. So you can kind of see where that slightly looking at the bigger picture only kind of comes into play. That's probably one of the biggest flaws as an example right there. And it's what I thought initially, and I still think that now, albeit I'm still a bit iffy about it as usual. And so, but we don't know for certain. Again, that's just my conjecture. That's what I imagine their mindset was. And the only way we'll get a definitive answer is through future world quests, expansions, or perhaps even the upcoming summer event, which might give us a bit more answers that we might be looking for sure. So that was the first assumption. So let's move to the next one. The second major assumption that we had revolved was around Irminsul's destruction. That was the second major assumption that we had. For a long time, many of us believed that Dottore was going to be the one to ultimately burn Irminsul. As it turns out, we were wrong, because turns out it was just Nahida. It was Nahida who burned it, not the Torii. And specifically, Nahida used the Pyranosis to destroy Irminsul. Now, when it comes to this particular theory, there were some things we got right and some things we got wrong. So let's start with the part that we got wrong. So the biggest mistake was assuming that the Torii would be the one to carry it out. That didn't happen. Nahida was ultimately responsible. The reason why we thought it was the Torii was because in the Winter Nights Lazo trailer, you saw the Torii standing right there with Irminsul burning. And then it cut to Kale waking up from that dream or that nightmare. That's why we thought it was going to be the Torii. And to a degree, it made sense that we would think that, oh, the antagonist would be the one to destroy something so fundamental to this world. We did not realize that it would do a whole switch up and that it was Nahida herself who destroyed it. However, one thing we did get right was the involvement of the Pyranosis. We did get that part right. A lot of people had already theorized that if Irminsul was going to be burned, then something connected to Pyro would likely play a role. So naturally, many of us started wondering, could the Pyranosis be involved? And it turns out that it was. The Pyranosis became a key component in Irminsul's destruction. If anything, that was the cause of its burning. So while we were wrong about who did it, we were right about what would be used to destroy it. It was honestly shocking to watch unfold. I remember sitting there thinking, wait, Nahida was the one who destroyed Irminsul? I thought it was going to be the Torii all along. But because for years we associated Nahida with protecting Irminsul. She's its Archon, its caretaker, and its guardian. So it made sense that we think that she would be the one to try to protect it, not destroy it. So seeing her use her own authority to destroy it felt completely backward at first. But then the quest immediately explains why, which is honestly fascinating. After Irminsul was destroyed, we get that incredible scene where Nahida speaks with the Shades, and honestly, that scene itself was insane. Insane. During that conversation, Nahida says something that really stood out to me. She essentially states, it's because I honor and revere it that it must be destroyed. And that changes everything, at least with added context. Because the point wasn't that Nahida stopped caring about Irminsul, it was the exact opposite. She cared so much that she accepted that reality that it couldn't be saved. Irminsul had become corrupted beyond recovery. It was beyond saving due to the cause of the Abyss. And there was no cure, there was no repair, no restoration. Nothing could bring it back. So, and because of that, the only remaining option was destruction. That's what she chose. And interestingly enough, that also reminded me of a line that an NPC said in Nicole's trailer that said, and if the hands of fate turn towards destruction, I think something around those lines. But that basically almost kind of probably foreshadowed that the system of fate was to turn towards destruction. The system of fate itself was going to be destroyed. At least that's what I think. And then we get another interesting moment. Ryandaughtr appears, which is, again, huge. I mean, we all love Ryandaughtr. And says, since you already become the tree now, what's the point of cutting down another old tree? And when I heard that line, I immediately reminded myself of a theory that I posted on X a while back, or Twitter. So, not many people saw it and it didn't get much interaction, but the similarities jumped out to me almost instantly. So the theory was based on the Byakuya Koku collection, specifically the passage known as the Parable of the Tree. So if I remember correctly, it was connected to Before Sun and Moon, although I'd have to double check that. It's most likely that it is. So the story describes a gardener and a tree spirit who loved one another. Now, obviously, not every part of the parable aligns perfectly with what happened in the quest, but some parts fit surprisingly well, others don't. But the similarities are still worth discussing either way. So the theory I posted went something along like this. I suggested that the parable might be an allegorical representation of the events occurring in Tevat's history. In the story, the king, or perhaps the incarnation of the primordial one, must cut down a tree in order to repair Pillar. And at the time, I theorized that this represented Conria being destroyed in order to repair the leylands after they had been damaged by the Abyss. Now, after this quest, I think parts of that interpretation were wrong. So instead, it seems more likely that the tree being cut down wasn't Conria, it was Irminsul itself. Or more specifically, Nahida, the branch of Irminsul that survives after the original tree was removed. Their purpose wasn't simply repairing the ley lines, it was preserving the world's future after Irminsul had already become corrupted. So while my original interpretation wasn't completely accurate, I do think the core symbolism still connects surprisingly well, at least in my own opinion. And so the next question is this: who exactly is the gardener? Because there are two possibilities, right? I'd say a couple possibilities, but it's just two. One possibility is the Torre. Now, I know the parable says that the gardener and the tree spirit were in love. That doesn't necessarily mean romantic love. Allegories often use love to represent deep connections between ideas, purposes, or destinies, or concepts. And in this interpretation, the Torah and Nahida are deeply connected through knowledge. Nahida represents wisdom, the Torah pursues knowledge obsessively. Even if they stand on the opposite sides, philosophically, their stories constantly intersect around the same concept: knowledge, wisdom, information. The parable then says that the gardener and the tree spirit take their plea to the king's priest. Well, not the tree spirit, but the gardener took their plea to the king's priest. The passage interpreted that figure as the incarnation of Tokoyo Okami, or as we know, Istaroth, the ruler of time. And according to the story, the priest instructs them to cut down the tree but to preserve one branch. And that branch is then planted into the earth. The gardener then kind of responds back saying that it will take 500 years for that branch to grow. When I originally wrote about this, I theorized that 500 years represented Lumine gathering the memories of Conrail in order to restore it. But looking back now, I think there's another interpretation that makes a bit more sense. Perhaps those 500 years symbolize the period between Greater Lord Rukkhadevata and Nahida, a cycle in which the old tree is cut down while a new branch is planted and allowed to mature. After all, Nahida was literally born from the purest branch of Irminsul. It's quite literally shown and said in the main storyline. The parable then continues with the king's priest saying, "Your one thought shall echo through eternity." Then, after the branch is planted, it instantly grows into a new tree, and the tree spirit survives. That's a key detail. Not because the original tree survives, but because the spirit itself continues within the new tree. It's a continuation of the previous spirit in that tree. And that's where things became really, really interesting, to me at least, because that's almost exactly what happened in the quest. Irminsul was destroyed, it was burned, it was cut down. But Nahida wasn't destroyed along with it. Instead, she effectively transferred her connection to Aru, who now serves as the world's new spirit tree. In other words, the tree changed, but the spirit remained. So when Rhine-Daughter says, if a new tree had already been born, what problem is there in cutting down the old one? That line suddenly takes on a completely different meaning. The old tree can die because the continuation already existed. It's already grown instantly into a new tree. The spirit survives, the cycle continues, and that idea mirrors the parable almost perfect. But then I started considering another possibility of who the gardener might be. Maybe the Torre wasn't the gardener at all, but instead, maybe the gardener is the traveler. Think about it. The traveler is often described as the first sage of Buer. Nahida herself called him, or her, depending on who you choose, as the first sage of Buer. If I were translating that relationship into Honkai Star Rail terminology, I'd almost describe the traveler as Nahida's first emanator. Not literally, of course, but in terms of trust, partnership, influence, and it's a surprisingly similar dynamic, albeit with some different details and caveats there. So the traveler and Nahida share the closest bond in the game. So perhaps the love reference in the parable is describing that connection instead. Not romance, just an incredibly strong bond. The traveler was also deeply concerned about the consequences of destroying Irminsul. That concern becomes important if they're meant to parallel the gardener. The gardener worries about the tree. The traveler worries about Irminsul. The parallels begin to stack up. You can see that. Then the parable introduces another fascinating line. It says, "For it was the god of moments who would carry seeds from this moment into the past and future." Immediately my mind went to Istaroth, the god of moments, Tokoyo Okami, and suddenly the entire sequence started to feel even more connected. And what made the quest so incredible was that Nahida wasn't just speaking to one shade, she wasn't just speaking to Rhine-Daughter. We saw Nibirius, and we saw Renova. Well, Nibirius is Rhine-Daughter, my bad, but we saw Renova, and more importantly, we saw Istaroth as well. the very figure associated with time itself. When you combine with the parable of the tree, things start to become almost absurdly interconnected. Things start to look uncannily similar, almost like a mirrored reflection of the story. Honestly, a bit of a personal opinion, Enkanomiya continues to surprise me. It's crazy how many answers were sitting there all along. It's just hidden under the concepts of interpretation, concepts, context, and lots of different perspectives. So books like Before Sun and Moon contained an unbelievable amount of information. We just didn't fully understand what we were looking at yet. Again, mostly clarifications and different perspectives that we looked at. And I think that's one of the coolest things about Genshin's lore. Sometimes you read something years before it becomes relevant, and then a quest comes out and suddenly everything clicks, and you realize, oh wow, that's what they were talking about the whole time. When I first read the Parable of the Tree, I assumed it had been written by a Brax at first. Later I learned it was actually written by a scribe, as the actual books later then said that how could I call myself the scribe of Tokoya Okami, so it was not written by a Brax. But what was interesting is that a Brax still remains relevant, even after that, because during the Temple of Space quest, Historia, one of the NPCs in the Temple of Space world quest, mentions that Abrax is one of his students during that time, at least that he was alive, and was exceptionally skilled at using analogies. And when you look at the Before Sun and Moon passages of Abrax speaking, he speaks in a lot of analogies, so you can kind of understand why I thought that. So I still think that there's a possibility that his influence can be felt throughout that story. I feel that Abrax's influence became that sort of inspiration that the scribe used for, the Parable of the Tree, the Parable of the Sun, and so on and so forth. It was amazing to really see that. Kind of to see that come into fruition. Either way, that book contained an enormous number of answers. And as I progressed through this quest, I kept noticing similarities between the events unfolding on the screen and passages I'd read in Before Sun and Moon. The connections just keep appearing. And honestly, I never expected that to happen. There are probably even more passages connected to this quest that I haven't caught on yet. If I find any additional examples, I'll either include them in the pinned comments or edit them directly into the video later. Okay, so apart from the Parable of the Tree, there were a few other passages that stood out to me while playing the quest. I just checked them out. So one of them was this. Prophecy holds that the dragon sovereign of water will be born in human form. Now, admittedly, this one is a little more obvious. Most people immediately associate that passage with Neuvillette, and it is confirmed that it was Neuvillette. But what makes it relevant here in this current quest is what we learned during the quest itself. Apep was able to sense the return of the Dragon Sovereign's authority. She sensed that Neuvillette got his Dragon Sovereign authority back in his own possession. That moment of authority was reclaimed. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. The dragons knew, or Apep knew. And my immediate reaction was just, yo, that is crazy. I was overtaken by the hype. Because if the dragons can sense the sovereigns regain their authority, then why can't Irminsul? Or maybe it can, maybe it always could, but maybe it simply didn't respond to it. And that immediately got me thinking. Perhaps this ties back to the idea that the heavenly principles isn't flawless. Maybe one of Phanes' flaws, maybe one of Phanes' flaws, or one of the limitations of the system they created, is that certain things can exist outside of its control without triggering an immediate response. And speaking of Phanes, this was another misconception that a lot of us had. Not a lore misconception this time, it's a pronunciation misconception, or at least a little mistake that we had. So, for many years, many of us pronounced his name as Phanes, but then the quest came out, or at least Nicole's trailer came out, and we learned that the intended pronunciation is closer to Phanes, or Phanes as they said in the trailer. And honestly, when I saw Deweet's reaction, shout out to Deweet by the way, I'll try to link his video in the description below, I couldn't help but laugh. It was hilarious. No hate towards him, of course. It was just one of those moments where you feel a tiny little bit of vindication. It was honestly pretty satisfying to see. But you're sitting there thinking, so it really was pronounced that way all along. What surprised me even more is that when when it looked at the original Greek pronunciation, it actually lined it up pretty well. Now, I completely understand why most English speakers still say feigns. It's easier, it flows more naturally in the English language and the English tongue. And even when people know the original pronunciation, they'll often default back to the English version simply because it's more comfortable to say. So for those who don't know, the original Greek pronunciation is phonies. It's phonies. In the Cole's trailer, it's phanies. That's more of the slightly Greek/English pronunciation. I don't know why they decided to do that. The voice direction knew what they were doing, and I won't complain at all. So, while it was technically a misconception, it's one of those misconceptions that's pretty understandable. Another assumption many of us got wrong was Dottoro's status before the Archon quest came out. For a long time, people assumed that the original Dottore was still alive somewhere. Maybe older, maybe weakened, maybe hidden away, but still alive. As it turns out, that doesn't appear to be the case. What we learned during the livestream and throughout the quest is that what remained wasn't exactly Dottore himself. It was a soul fragment, a segment, basically. A continuation, but not the original body. The original Dottore had already died long ago. That revelation actually lines up with one of the misconceptions many of us held. We thought that there was still an original version of Dottore somewhere out there overseeing everything. We thought that he was the brain of the hive mind of the Dottore segments. We thought that the original specimen was still alive, but no, he was dead quite a long time ago. Instead, the surviving versions were the segments. And those were the versions that continued to exist. And those were the versions carrying his legacy forward. Although I do say legacy, but it's more so that they just carried his desires and his own ambitions forward. And honestly, I found that reveal pretty incredible. I found it pretty amazing. Because I remember thinking, wait, this is insane. This is mind-blowing. Because I had always thought that the original Dottore was still alive, but he was dead all along. Because it's one of those assumptions that had been around for years, and people had built theories around it. And entire discussions were based on the idea that the original Dottore was still there, just, old and decrepit. And then the quest comes along and completely dismantles that assumption, that theory that we had. That's part of what makes this quest so interesting. It forces you to reevaluate a lot of long-standing theories, too. And things that felt almost certain suddenly aren't at all. And it makes you wonder how many other assumptions we're carrying into the endgame without even realizing it. Another misconception, and honestly, there were a lot of them, like a lot. One of the biggest involved the Pyronosis. Before the quest, many of us assumed that either Dottore would obtain a Pyronosis, or that the Traveler would have the Pyronosis, and it would eventually make its way to the Tsaritsa. And that seemed like the obvious outcome, at least to us, logically speaking. After all, collecting the Gnosis has been one of the Fatui's major goals throughout the story. Instead, something far stranger happened. By the end of the quest, basically the Pyronosis was gone. So that left us with a few possibilities. Possibility number one, it's gone. Completely destroyed, and honestly, that's not impossible. Think about it. What was the Pyronosis used for during the quest? First, Mawika used it in the conjunction with the Divine Throne's power during the Natlan Archon story quest when she used the incandescent Ode of Resurrection for all the people of Natland. Then later, in the quest, it became an instrument of destruction to Irminsul itself. Nahida used divine authority to carry out an act that fundamentally altered the structure of the world. And that's not exactly a minor use case, really. So it is entirely possible that the Gnosis paid the price. That using it for something of that scale consumed it completely. Possibility number two, the Gnosis survived and someone simply recovered it afterward. And if that's the case, there are a few suspicious candidates. Pantalone was present during the aftermath. He's one of the suspects. Dottore's side of events was still connected even after everything happened. albeit he did die completely for good as we saw he disappeared. But there's always a possibility that someone retrieved it off screen. You know, maybe it was like a little off screen steal. Or possibility number 3, which is probably less likely, but it's still a good one nonetheless. The Gnosis somehow returned to the Traveler. I don't necessarily think that's the likely outcome, personally speaking, but considering how unusual the circumstances were, it's not something I'd completely dismiss. I still think the simplest answer is that the Gnosis was destroyed completely, because if destroying Irmin's soul carried a cost, then sacrificing the Gnosis as part of that cost would make a lot of sense. In fact, it's possible that the Shades themselves demanded that price, even if they didn't say it. I mean, think about it. If you're destroying the system of fate itself, then perhaps the instrument used to accomplish that act must also be destroyed at some point, right? It's a form of balance, a consequence, a payment, a price. Again, that's just speculation on my part, but it feels plausible. And regardless of what happened to the Gnosis, we know one thing for certain. Malvika seems completely fine without it. She even says that she views it as primarily an elemental energy enhancer. Useful? Sure. Necessary? Not so much. Then, judging by everything we've seen from her in the Natlan Archon quest, she's more than capable of standing on her own without the need of the Gnosis. Now, this one surprised a lot of people, myself included, because for years there was a fairly common assumption regarding the god remains inside of Kale. Back in the manga, the remains appeared corrupted, twisted, almost serpent-like, and because of that, many people concluded that the remains belonged to Orobashi. And honestly, that theory made a lot of sense, because by that point of the story, we already knew about the Taragami, we knew Orobashi's remains still existed, we knew that they had a corrupting influence, and we knew that Tottori had been involved in experimenting with dangerous divine remnants. And then we learned through Wanderer's Archon quest that Tottori had a role in bringing the Taragami into the Tatarasuna furnace. Once you connected those dots, the theory practically builds itself. But Tottori had access to Orobashi's remains, and Orobashi's remains are among the most accessible god remains in the setting. They're in Inazuma, they're present on the surface, and they're known to be corruptive. And Kale's condition appeared to match what we understood about them. So naturally, many of us assumed that was the answer. Turns out, we were wrong, and the remains inside Kale belonged to Nabu Malikata, the goddess of flowers. So for anyone unfamiliar with her, which honestly, it's quite fine, the notes does say who she is, I think. It's been a while, I need to check that again. Nabu Malikata was one of the divine figures who existed during the era of King Deshret and Greater Lord Rukkhadevata. She played a major role in the ancient history of Sumeru. She was actually an angel. And numerous artifact descriptions and lore entries detail her relationship with both of them and the events surrounding the civilization. So eventually she perished as a consequence of her involvement with forbidden knowledge, and the quest explains that fragments of her remained scattered afterward. That's what the current Archon quest said. Nicole basically stated that. And apparently, Tottori managed to obtain some of those fragments. Through what means, we don't know, but we know that he somehow did. And what's fascinating is that this actually explains something in the manga a bit more clearly. The god remains inside Kale became increasingly corrupted over time. At first glance, that seems strange, but once you remember what we learned in Sumeru's World Quest, during the Sumeru World Quest, it started making sense. During our encounters with Lilopar during the World Quest, and the lore surrounding the goddess of flowers, we learned that Nabu Malikata became corrupted through her contact with the Abyss, causing her demise. And so if the fragments of her power survived, it would make sense that those fragments carry traces of the corruption as well, of the Abyss. And when the Archon quest finally confirmed it, a lot of pieces suddenly clicked into place. And what initially seemed like a contradiction ended up fitting surprisingly well with the information we'd already been given years earlier. And honestly, that's one of my favorite kinds of lore reveals. The ones that don't just answer a mystery, but they also recontextualize things we thought we already understood. So, apart from all that, I'm honestly starting to think that it might not be very long before we get even more answers. The next version is shaping up to be a very interesting one. Right now, I'm not entirely sure whether we're immediately moving to the next major version cycle, or if we're going to continue into Luna 8 first. Either way, I'm interested to see where things go here. If we are getting Luna 8, then honestly, that's great, because they just released the drip marketing for Sandrone, and I have to say, she looks pretty sick. For those who haven't seen it yet, definitely go check it out on Twitter or X, but if you're too lazy to do that, well, here you go. Boom, it's right here. And honestly, I think the design is amazing. And more importantly, Sandrone's arrival could mean that we're finally getting closer to some long-awaited answers. Not just answers about the Fatui, not just answers about the Torre or Snezhnaya, but potentially answers about the Tsaritsa herself, which is honestly huge. That's one of the things I'm most interested in moving forward, as well as other expansions and world quests moving along. We've heard opinions from other characters about the Tsaritsa throughout the years. We've heard stories, we've heard speculations, we've come up with speculations and conjectures, but we still haven't truly spent time with her as a character yet. So maybe Sandrone's release brings us one step closer to that, to understanding her a bit more. Maybe we'll get more lore, maybe we'll get additional voice lines, maybe we'll learn something completely unexpected. At this point, who knows? And honestly, that's what makes this period of the story so exciting. A lot of the assumptions we've carried for years are finally being tested. Some of them were completely wrong, some of them were partially correct, and some of them ended up being much closer to the truth than we originally realized, which is honestly pretty dope. The quest didn't just give us answers, it forced us to re-examine a lot of the things that we thought we understood. A lot of the theories that we had, we ended up having to dismantle them and come up with new ones, or have to accept these new answers that, the developers gave us. Things that felt certain suddenly aren't, and things that seem impossible suddenly looked plausible. And old pieces of lore that many of us overlooked are becoming relevant again. When I look back at everything we talked about today, Ermintel's origins, the parable of the tree, the role of Nahida, the dragon sovereigns, the Torre, the pyronosis, calling the goddess of flowers, it all points to one thing. We're entering a part of the story where old mysteries are finally starting to pay off. And I think that's why this quest hit so hard for so many people. It wasn't just shocking, it was validating. Years of theories, speculation, world quests, item descriptions, books, and hidden lore entries are finally beginning to connect together. Of course, there are still plenty of unanswered questions, there are still mysteries surrounding the heavenly principles, there are still questions about the shades, there are still questions about the Tsaritsa, Conria, and whatever lies ahead. But for the first time in a while, it feels like we're getting closer to those answers. Albeit it's also possible that we might get more questions later on too, as Hoyoverse always tends to do. I don't know why, but they just love to do that. They're sadistic people. And honestly, I can't wait to see what happens next. Anyways, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about today. Those were some of the biggest assumptions, misconceptions, and theories that many of us had before this quest release. And there were some completely debunked, some that were clarified, and some that gained entirely new meaning after seeing the story unfold, which is honestly quite amazing. If you enjoyed my video, feel free to leave your thoughts below. I'm curious to hear what assumptions you had before playing this quest, and whether any of them ended up being right. Hey guys, so you made it to the end part of this video. So if you skipped to this timestamp, it's possible that you were too lazy or you didn't want to hear any of the misconceptions. So honestly, fair game, that's your choice. Honestly, I get it too. So for this part, I'm basically going to show a tidbit of an audio that I created. So I noticed a lot of people are creating a lot of OCs or original characters, for sure. Some people might not know what that means. A lot of people are like, what's an OC? And it's an original character for those who don't know, just in case. I'm sure many of you already know, but just for those who don't know what that is, you're welcome. So, I created an OC, long story short. I don't have the design yet, but I do know what they look like to some degree. I could explain it, but it's way too hard to say it into words. The only way I could do it is if I drew it, and that's gonna take some time. So what I did in that audio, I created some voice lines based on the actual Genshin menu voice lines and the character menus. And that's pretty much what it is. It's like it was just me speaking and so on and so forth. It's not complete, but it is like a good amount of lines that I had, so it is one of those things that I decided to create just on the spur of the moment. It was a bit of a whim thing. So I'm gonna put it right here, and yeah, enjoy.
Hello, my name is Atlas.
My bloodline descends from the people of Delphi Pytho, or known today as Enkanomiya. If you are curious about the past, you may come to me. I don't mind basic chit-chat, but don't waste my time when there are more important things to do. Forgive me. It's a bad habit of mine in the past. You may speak to me anytime you wish. You wish to rest? I can tell you look exhausted. Your eyes are beginning to hollow. Sit with me. I shall give you any answer you seek. It's raining. Come, let's get under the trees. We don't want you to be so. Otherwise, it will detriment you in battle. Thunderstrikes are said to be the wrath of the heavens, but in truth, they're just a cause of fear and mercy. What do I mean? I mean that the divine is in fear, which is why they strike thunder and lightning. Never mind. You'll understand soon enough. The skies have cleared up. Come, let's move forward. The Lord of Time waits for no one. The might of the sun always remains constant, even in the veil of this world. Oh, nothing. Just talking to myself. The winds of the past will guide those to reach the future with their own hands. At least, that's what my family told me when I was young. The wind is nice. Rest up for a bit. Even the world knows when enough is enough. Once the breeze slows down, we keep going. Good morning. You seem to have rested well. Good. There are things that we need to do before the morning ends. Afternoon. Do you want some water? Or maybe a quick nap? Best to let your body relax before you take it too far. It's getting dark. The sun shall fall, and the ancient witness of the moon shall rise once again. You should sleep. It's only important to not only rest, but to dream. For those always carry an answer, at least in this world. Very well then. Good night. I am from a bloodline that carries the heavy truths of this world. After my ancestors exited Enkanomiya from the depths, some traveled to Sumeru, hoping to keep our traditions, like the names and clothing we wear, as well as the forbidden use of visions. That is where my family is from. So, if you want to know the ancient history of this world, you may come to me. You and I are similar. We both hold the burden of bearing the truth in this world. But since you and I are good friends, know that I'll always be here for you, if you ever need me. My sword style is based on the ancient styles that come from an ancient civilization. It stayed alive all the way up to me. Currently, I'm the last wielder of this sword style. You're curious why I have no vision? Well, it's because if I become tethered to the false veil, I wouldn't be able to tell you the truths that you wish to know. But also, my will is strong enough to command an element. I choose Electro because it was the most useful and versatile. Okay, so you're back and you saw the audio. Heard the audio. I can't believe I said that. So, what do you guys think? Was it bad? Was it good? Let me know in the comments. I honestly think I have a lot to improve on, for sure. And can I think of it as a voice acting demo? Probably not. It's not like I'm debuting as a voice actor, so there's that. Again, thank you so much for watching this video. If I were to give some lasting thoughts or some little final words, do this. Try to think about at least some misconceptions that we thought before this quest came out, and what are some things that were clarified, as well as some ideas or theories that you might have for the next quest and for the next version of what might happen and what might happen in Snitch 9. Because a lot of things changed and a lot of things were blown to bits, and honestly right now we don't even know what's going to happen next. So this recent quest has some things that I might have missed, so whatever you think I missed, let me know down below, because I most likely did. So yeah, alright then, that's all for this video. See you guys later. Bye.